really with any kind of plot line, rather than just like circling the same state, like, I like to think of it as zigzags, instead of circling, we're zigzagging or something. And of course, you can have like a zigzag or a zag, as I like to say. In relationships, usually it's going to be like on a basic level, there's forces pushing together and pulling them apart.
Welcome to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast, where we focus on how authors found success, looking at strategies that have taken them to the top of the bestseller charts, as well as what they've learned from their mistakes. Because being an indie author is more than knowing the latest marketing trend. It's about being innovative and creative and learning from your mistakes.
Welcome to Wish I'd Known Then podcast. I'm Sarah Rosette.
And I'm Jamie Albright. And this week on the show we have
September Fawkes.
Yes, we do. Y'all, it was a great interview. And not only does she have a cool name, she actually was just such a great guest.
Yeah, she's a developmental editor, and she has a blog that has tons of popular information or tons of good information. And it's a really popular blog for writers. And I saw a post about relationship arcs, and it's something that I don't see people talking about. We always talk about like the hero's journey, but this was about how to have arcs within your story or within your series for your characters, like their relationships, like are they getting closer together, further apart? Is it positive, negative? And it was just really interesting. So I was like, ooh, I want to reach out to her. And she agreed to come on the podcast and talk to us about it. And it was just like a masterclass in relationship arcs. It was really good.
It really was. It was so good. I think you're going to really love it.
Yeah. So this sponsor this week is Xero, and you can use discount code Wish I'd Known Then 20 and get 20% off a Xero subscription for 3 months. And we'll tell you more about that later. Do you have any personal updates?
Oh gosh. No, I mean, I see here Sarah writes us a little script thing, and she said, you want to say it, hurricane burl math, hurricane math, disaster math, fly out, stay away for several days. That's, we
that was last week. Yeah. We talked about that last week.
We were at the beach all last week with Alexa's family, and we just had a great time. We were in Florida, and no sharks were seen, so that's good.
That is good. Always positive.
We did see a flying stingray. Like, did you know stingrays jump out of the water? I had no idea.
I've seen them in the water, like while I'm in the water.
This one jumped out twice. At first, I thought it was a dolphin, and then it did it again, and it had that big wingspan, and I was like, oh my gosh, that is a stingray. Had no idea.
Did you flee the water?
No, because it was pretty far out. But I mean, it was at a second sandbar. But
oh, nice.
It was amazing. But yeah, no, it was great. We had great weather. It wasn't too hot, and it was a very relaxing time. And but I'm ready to be back, which we got back yesterday, and I had phone issues really since the hurricane, and I just got it fixed today. So tomorrow I'm going to start like full-time work.
Nice.
Again, finally.
Nice. That'll be good. Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. I keep seeing social media messages that say, I want to live in precedented times, not unprecedented times, just precedented times, because we've had
normal
weather issues, tech issues. We're recording this after the CrowdStrike, IT, like political failure, political stuff going on. Yeah, it's kind of hard to concentrate on just work. So I hope we both get back to it. Pretty soon.
So that's what I've been doing. Nothing much.
Yeah. Well, today we're recording this on July 22nd, and today is the day my 1920s Egypt book launched to my direct store. To all the people who purchased from me, pre-ordered. It all worked great. It was, I did the book funnel pre-order for the audiobook and the ebook.
Right.
And then Book Vault for the print pre-orders. And it's all working. And I'm so happy because, that's the first time I've done pre-orders through my store. And it wasn't that hard. I got it all set up, and I checked this morning and they all went out. And I had pre-ordered it just to make sure. And I got my notifications, and I was like, okay, that's good.
Yep.
So that's all good. And people are really excited and happy that I have a new book out, and I'm happy that I have a new book out. I'm excited
Yes.
to get it out. And the pre-orders were not as high as like when I did the Kickstarter campaigns, but that's okay because I don't feel like I can do a Kickstarter campaign with every book because they are very time consuming.
Yeah.
So I figure I will do some launches on my store. And then if I want to, I will do a Kickstarter, but
Right.
I can just set it up on my store to get it out to my people. And then maybe
Right.
later, like when I have 2 books in the series, because this is a new series, I might do a Kickstarter for that and just have both books available. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
Gotcha.
So relieved that's done and happy.
Yes. Sarah is definitely the innovative one in this duo. So happy that that worked out.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad it's done. And
Yeah.
yeah, I feel kind of tired of being innovative. I may take some time off and not be innovative.
Well, we should talk about Inkers Con. The digital conference is July 20th through August the 2nd. So it's going on now, but I think you can still register, right?
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can use Sarah's code, Sarah24, all caps, or my code, Jamie24, and we'll have the link to in the show notes. And yeah, it's Jamie with no E, just JAMI 24, and Sarah with no H, SARA 24. And yeah, we appreciate you using our codes. We get a little bonus from that.
Little
So
affiliate link. Yeah.
a little affiliate
Yeah.
link. We always
But
let y'all know that.
yeah.
But
And they have courses and classes and online live meetups going on. And then you have access to all the content for, I think it's 6 years. So if you're interested in, you can't go to the in-person one, then this is a good option to see that content and then get additional content too.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just for new people, it's not just for established people, it's not just it's not something for just mid people. There's something for everyone. And there's not just one thing. I mean, there's a lot of things. Do we have new supporters?
No new supporters this week, but thanks to all the continuing supporters. And if you support the podcast, you can get access to previous supporter episodes and the Slack group. And you can do that at Wish I'd Known for Writers/support. And we just really do appreciate everyone sticking with us and, showing us that you're interested in us continuing the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Yep. We appreciate that very much. And then we got some text messages this week. Stanley B. Bryce said I'm sorry, Stanley B. Trice. Sorry, Stanley. I have been listening to the podcast on 1.5 speed. I recently upped it to 1.75, but 2.0 is too fast. So, not just our podcast, but all podcasts.
Yeah. So this is the how fast do you listen to your podcast questions on. So we're getting a couple of those. And then we also got a message last week that the podcast that went out last week was the audio tracks were doubled up in the beginning. And so that is fixed. We're not quite sure what happened there, but it's fixed. So if you had that and want to hear the intro, you can delete it and re-download it and it should all be fine now.
Yeah.
So sorry about that. That was a weird glitch. Yeah. So we have the corporate sponsor for this week is Xero. It's accounting software made for small businesses like indie authors. With Xero, you have everything in one place. You can store documents, capture expenses and receipts via email, scan files from your mobile, and more. Xero's robust integrations let you connect Xero to your bank account to easily sync financial information, as well as have access to more than 1,000 apps via its app store. There are different plans to suit your business, and all pricing plans cover the accounting essentials with room to grow. And I use Xero. I switched to it recently, and it's super easy to use. It imports transactions automatically, and reconciling is really fast. Their onboarding call was super helpful. And just, it's a great accounting solution for my indie author business. So you can use discount code Wish I'd Known Then 20 and get 20% off a Xero subscription for 3 months. And that link will be in the show notes.
Yep, it will. And we should get on with the show because September was amazing.
Yes. So here is September. Well, today we are really excited to talk to September Fawkes. How are you, September?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me on here.
Well, we're so glad you're here, and I love your name. So
I do too.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting name. So let me read your bio and we'll get started. September C. Fawkes works as a freelance developmental and line editor and writing instructor. She is best known for her award-winning writing tip blog at septembercfawkes.com. And that's Fawkes spelled Fawkes.
Yes.
If somebody wants to look it up.
Yeah. So how did you get into writing, September?
Well, it actually started clear back when I was 7 years old.
Yes.
So I'm one of those people who was always interested in the writing world. And I wrote my first story, and it was about chickens who needed to find water. And luckily, my mom was very wise, and she got me a binder to keep all my stories in. So I actually still have my first story that I ever wrote, which was illustrated and edited with big, fat, blacked out, words or whatever. Did not know how to spell everything I was trying to write. But at that point, like, I just loved the writing. I loved the writing world. I knew that I wanted to do something in that world. And at the same time, I don't necessarily think you have to be one of those people that, like, oh, ever since I was like a little kid or a toddler or whatever, you can totally get into this later in life. That's totally cool too. And then in college, I got an English degree and worked at the Writing Center. And after that, I got a job working for New York Times bestselling author David Farland. And he also does writing courses and freelance editing. So I helped with that too. And then I went off and started doing freelance editing on my own. But yeah, kind of like what my bio said though. I am best known for my blog, but I also like have an online writing course and stuff too now. So that's kind of my short version of my little story.
Very
I think
good.
that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we love editors because we need them very badly.
Yeah. I in particular.
So we always like to ask everybody, what is your definition of success? Because, so different for everyone.
Yeah, this is a good question because it really is so different for everyone. I mean, I'm tempted to pick like external milestones, but really, to be honest, to me, success is about like growing and progressing on a personal level and then helping other people to grow and progress as well. Obviously in the writing realm, that's helping people understand stories and how to write better, and also helping me like develop better discernment with that too. Like I feel like there's kind of this component of like pulling like what we kind of understand intuitively or subconsciously into kind of the conscious element and like figuring how that works and like applying it to our writing. But anyway, that could be kind of a tangent. But I guess to me, success is more like internal growth and personal progression and helping other people with theirs. And that's something that like we always have control over. Whereas like a lot of the external things, those are awesome and those can be like great milestones or whatever. But there's a little bit of luck involved, I feel like. Like there's a saying, the harder you work, the luckier you get, which I totally believe. But like I like having success being seen as something more internal because that's something I always have control over. I can always continue to learn and grow, and I can always try to help others to continue to learn and grow. So that's how I would personally define it.
Yeah.
It's a great definition. Yeah.
That is terrific. Yeah. Well, we wanted to have you on today because I saw your blog about relationship arcs, and I just thought it was so interesting, and I don't think anybody else is really talking about this. So I will put a link to the blog in the show notes, but let's just start by talking about what a relationship arc is and why it's important.
All right. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff on character arcs, like tons and tons of stuff on character arcs. And like, it's funny because a lot of writing approaches talk about how you need to have like a relationship plot line too. But I feel like there's not a lot of resources on what that is or how that looks like, unless you're writing the romance genre, in which case there's tons of great resources. Like I love Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes. I don't even write romance, but there's I feel like not a whole ton of direction out there. And, I was kind of having this realization that, well, relationships have arcs too, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about them in the writing world or defining them or whatever. So to me, a relationship arc is about how a character, or not a character, I'm used to talking about character arcs. To me, a relationship arc is about how a relationship grows or changes through the story. And if you're going to have a relationship plot line, you need more than just to have a relationship. You need a relationship arc to go through it as we follow this plot and these characters. as it goes through the story. So that's how I would define it. Why they're important, I think there's a few aspects. But kind of like what I brought up is a lot of approaches talk about having a relationship plot line. This is sometimes referred to as like the B story or the secondary plot, although in some genres and stories, it's more like the main story, like in romance. But relationship arcs and plot lines are really useful in that. So like if you think, so usually most stories are going to have like a main external plot line, and then like the internal plot line, which is usually related to the character arc, the character's internal journey. And when we add the relationship plot line, it adds dimension to the story. So like if we think about dimension, it's usually three measurements, like height, width, and depth. It's not height, and width. It's not width, depth. It's three different things. And so I think why the relationship plot line gets put into so many stories is it fits really well between the internal journey and the external journey because it's not as big and as broad and as far reaching as the external journey, but it's not as internal and intimate as the internal journey. So it kind of fits between that. And I feel like it gives the story and the plot more dimension to kind of work with. And like, of course, the main plot line or the A story, a lot of people like to define that as both the internal external journey. Sometimes we need to take a little break from that if this is a longer story. And so a relationship plot line is a great thing to kind of add in there and kind of explore the relationship arc. So that's kind of how it links to plot, but it's also pretty important in theme usually. So there's like a few approaches like Dramatica theory and even like Save the Cat. And they talk about how having a relationship plot line with a relationship arc is like a crucial element to theme. And some even feel like this is where theme really happens. I personally wouldn't take it that far. If you like to view it that way, cool. But I do think it's a major key element and can be really useful in working with your story's theme. Because often in a relationship plot line, you have these characters who are obviously talking to each other. A lot of times they're having to work together. Not always, it depends on what type you're writing. And in the process of this, there's usually some kind of argument or whatever. And a lot of times those conversations and their different approaches end up being somehow thematic. Like they might have both different, like, for example, if I have a theme about, I don't know, perseverance. One character might be saying, okay, we need to be really persevering about this situation and solve this conflict, while the other one's arguing that that's actually a waste of time and we should just quit or something. So you have these two characters who are linked together somehow in an important relationship, and you can explore them a little bit more obviously there through their conversations and their interactions and how they move forward in the story. I think the A story definitely still is very thematic, but oftentimes it's a little bit less obvious, I feel like. Whereas in a relationship plot line, you can explore those things in a little bit more of obvious ways. And so I think it's important to both plot and theme, obviously character, because it helps you explore the characters as well. So that's why I would say they're pretty important.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense for me. Like the mystery might be the main plot, but then you've got the relationship between the detectives or, the small town relationships or whatever is the relationship arc.
Yeah, totally. That would totally work.
Well, what are the 4 basic types of relationship arcs?
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's definitely go through those. So I feel like, so like character arcs, I feel like there's so many different like detailed ways you can look at this. But I feel like going to just the basics and foundations and building from there is really effective. I personally am like a big believer in getting your foundations and your basics down and then building off of that because you can always come back to those things. So I feel like relationship arcs break down into 4 categories. And I actually also feel like character arcs at the basic level do as well. So basically your options are this is either going to change or it's going to stay kind of the same at the beginning and at the end. And that's either going to be seen as a positive thing or a negative thing. So when we look at that for relationships, that gives us 4 options. It can change positively, it can change negatively, it can be positive. I like to use the term steadfast, like kind of remaining the same, It can be positive steadfast or negative steadfast. And that's how those things kind of break down. So in relationships, when I think of positive and negative, I think of so a positive relationship arc is where the characters are going to grow closer. Maybe in love or respect or trust for each other ultimately by the end. And in a negative relationship arc, those it's going to be that these characters grow apart and usually they're going to be more distant. They might grow in disrespect or distrust of one another.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the basic rundown. Do you want me to go into more detail about each one?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
that'd
I
be
think
great.
that would be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Okay, yeah. So basically, yeah, those are the different directions it can kind of grow. And so I forgot to mention this part too, but so we have positive and negative, but also looking at is the relationship changing or is it kind of staying the same? Which I kind of touched on. So that kind of gives us this little grid of those 4 different types. So looking at those in more detail. So in a positive, they're going to grow closer together in love, respect, trust at the end of the story, through the story. So in a positive change, out of all of the relationship arcs, this is the most common. And this is also like the most common for character arcs at the basic level. Usually, the protagonist has a positive change or transformation. When we look at that with relationships, that's also the most common type of relationship arc. So in this type of relationship arc, it's the relationship's gonna do kind of like basically a 180 flip from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. So the characters are going to go from being largely strangers or maybe even like enemies, and then they become best friends or found family or significant others or something. Now, there is sometimes this idea that the characters have to start out hating each other. You can definitely do that if you want. But even if they're just distant or they don't know each other, that would still fit here, just being distant in some way. And then, like the obstacles of the journey, are going to have these characters drawing closer together in love and respect. So, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, obviously we have Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. They don't even know each other in the beginning, and it's not long before Elizabeth is like, wow, this guy is way too prideful for his own good. He doesn't even want to dance with me. But over the coming months, Darcy kind of falls for her. And by the end of the story, they've grown closer together and they're ready to get married, right? I think it's easy to look at romantic relationships because that's what we think of a lot, but it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship for a relationship arc, right? So, like, another example I like to use is in Monsters Inc. Sully at first is like really terrified of Boo, and he wants to get her back to where she came from, and he wants to be distant from her. But the conflicts of the story ends up pulling them closer together and they grow really close that way. So that's kind of more of like a parent-child type of relationship. So you could use this for other types of relationships. This is a very common one, probably most familiar type. A lot of times these characters are pushed together from other forces and circumstances, and they grow to appreciate each other. Maybe they have kind of the same goal or something. But also, it can be a little different too. It could even be that these characters meet each other and they want to be close, but something else is pushing them apart. Like this is kind of what happens in Romeo and Juliet. They want to be close, but these other families are pushing them apart more. Do you want me to? Should I just keep going to the next one, or do you guys want to chime in at all?
Well, I'm just listening, but you go ahead.
I'm absorbing. I think this is great.
Okay.
And I love the examples. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah.
So yeah,
All right.
keep going and keep giving us some examples if I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you've
Oh
got
no,
examples.
I got lots
Perfect.
of notes. I've taught a class on this, but I just didn't know if you guys wanted more like back
Well, I
and
would say
forth,
let's get
so.
through the major types, and then
Yeah.
maybe we'll
Okay.
have some more questions.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so the next one I'm going to go through is positive, steadfast relationship arcs. So in this type, the characters start close, they start already close, and at the end, they're also closer, even closer, usually to some degree. So instead of doing like a big flip or experiencing like a big change, the relationship is going to be more or less the same at the beginning of the story and at the end of the story. So instead of like transforming, you could say it grows in resolve. They're more resolved, more committed to each other. Now, sometimes these types of relationships will stay pretty much the same through the whole story, in which case, like, it's a relationship arc, but it's probably not really like a relationship plot line. If you want it to be a relationship plot line, it likely needs to grow by degree. So, meaning that the characters get even closer to each other by the end of the story, or perhaps better said, because of the story. So, a positive, steadfast relationship doesn't necessarily mean like this relationship never wavers or never has obstacles. It's just that, like, when all is said and done at the end, the characters remain loyal to each other. So, a lot of people struggle with these types of relationships. Also, if you apply this to characters, these types of characters that already start out really good, and then they're also even good at the end. A lot of people struggle with writing these. Like, how do I write this? So, a commonly meant I hear is like, well, what do I do when the characters are already together or they're already in love? And this tends to come up in particular with sequels, right? And a common mistake that writers make is they just try to undo what already happened through like a weak antagonistic force, and then they just try to redo it. And that, I'm sure we've all had experiences seeing that in sequels where a lot of times that falls flat and doesn't work because we're like, well, we just saw them conquer all this stuff in the previous installment and they got so close and it was so amazing. And now we're just kind of like undoing that and like doing it again. So in order for this to really work, if you want this to be like a strong relationship plot line, you need to have like a real antagonistic force that could believably try to push these characters apart in realistic ways. You don't want it to be something weak, it needs to be something more difficult than what they went through in the first installment, or somehow different but just as difficult, or something that is taking the place over like a long duration of time, if I can kind of explain it that way. So, like, over time, it's wearing them down. So, really, in this type of relationship arc, it's about testing the relationship. So, you want to think, how can I believably test this relationship to threaten to pull these characters apart? And in doing that, you're also showing how much these characters ultimately are willing to be together, right? So, some examples of that is one of my favorite examples personally is from Lord of the Rings. They emphasize this more in the film version than the book. So Frodo and Sam, they already start like in a positive relationship. They already know each other, but the journey of the story threatens to separate them. Right? Frodo first he wants to bear this burden alone, and then later Smeagol comes along, and we have issues with the ring, and it begins to chip apart at this relationship. And eventually, at least in the film version, because the book version is a little different, they go their separate ways. And eventually, Frodo realizes he actually does really need Sam, and Sam also is like, you know what, Frodo really needs me. And so they come back together, and they're only able to make it to the crack of doom by Sam, like carrying Frodo over his shoulders, and they're able to succeed. So I think like that is an amazing example of how a positive, steadfast relationship arc can work really well. You can also see this in some renditions of Spider-Man, where like Peter Parker and Mary Jane or another love interest are already close, and then maybe they're struggling through the middle, but they ultimately stay together, end up together at the end. So those are the positives: positive change, positive steadfast. So we're going to talk about the negatives. And when we think of relationship arcs and plot lines, we usually think of drawing characters close together, right? But it's also possible to arc a relationship by pulling the characters apart. So instead of growing in love and respect and trust, they ultimately grow in dislike, disrespect, and distrust and distance. Okay. And so that's going to fall into one of these two categories. So negative change, which will be the first one I'll talk about. So this is the opposite of positive change, obviously. So in a negative change, the relationship is going to change because of the story, but in a negative way. So usually it's going to be like a 180 flip from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. So the starting of the story, or the starting of the relationship plot line, because sometimes those start in Act 2, the characters are going to go from being like best friends or found family or significant others, just being close somehow, to eventually largely strangers or even downright enemies. So the negative change relationship arc is about the deterioration of a relationship. So instead of overcoming like the challenges of the plot thrown at their relationship and like drawing closer together, which is what the positive ones do, these obstacles and these conflicts are ultimately, and sometimes it's not even like obstacles, sometimes it's just distractions or differences in the relationship. They're tearing this relationship apart so that these people are growing in dislike, disrespect, or distrust, and just ultimately becoming more distant. So, for example, my example in Revenge of the Sith, which I know a lot of people don't like the Star Wars prequels, but out of them, Revenge of the Sith is the most solid, and it's a good example to use for this, okay? Because we're familiar with it usually. So we have Anakin and Obi-Wan who have the main relationship plotline. There's also one with Padme, but I would argue this is the primary relationship plotline. And they begin the story as close as brothers, is what it says. And Anakin even goes out of his way to save Obi-Wan. He goes against orders, he risks people's lives to save Obi-Wan because he feels that close to his master. But of course, as things develop with the Jedis and Palpatine and Anakin's seduced to the dark side, halfway through, he's like, you know what? I think I accept Obi-Wan needs to die. And you're like, okay, well, that's a big change. And then by the time we get to the climax, he's actually okay with killing Obi-Wan himself. And he even says that he hates Obi-Wan. So definitely deterioration from something very close, very positive, to now these characters are basically killing each other. I know that Obi-Wan wants to kill him, but he does leave him for dead, technically, although he survives. But anyway, so that's example of negative change. The Hunger Games, either as a whole or if you just want to look at Mockingjay, Gale and Katniss also have negative change. They go from being close to ultimately pulling apart when Gale is willing to do these war tactics that go against what Katniss believes. And then finally, we have the negative steadfast relationship arc. So this is going to be where the characters start apart and they end apart. So they might be strangers or enemies, and they ultimately end up that way. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the characters never get close or never love each other through the middle. They might even like flirt with the idea that they're always going to be together. But when all is said and done, the characters don't stand by each other. And you could also have a negative steadfast where they do just kind of hate each other through the whole thing. So there's kind of those different options there. But beginning and end, they're apart. So the story is going to test their resolve to be strangers or enemies, a lot of times by offering opportunities for them to reconcile or draw closer together. But at the end, there's going to be a bigger divide. So a way to kind of explain this is, we could hate a stranger or an enemy, right? But usually you're not going to hate a stranger or enemy as much as you hate like an ex, because you were once close to that person. And so you're more likely to be hurt by that person, and you're going to feel even more distant or more hatred toward that person, probably. So that's kind of how it grows by degree. Examples, 1984. We have Winston and Julia. They start out as strangers. At first, Winston's not really sure about Julia because he thinks she's a spy, but they get together, they start this secret love affair. It gets even to the point where Julia's like, I'll do anything against the party, but I will never betray Winston. But at the climax, they both end up betraying each other. And then they run into each other in the falling action, and they don't have any of the previous affections for each other that they had. They don't have those desires, and they just kind of go their separate ways. So that's an example where they're apart, draw close, and end apart. You can also, like I mentioned, do something where they just kind of hate each other through the whole thing. So yeah, in the film The Prestige, this is a good example of that, which is one of the reasons I like to use it, because we don't see this very often. And it's interesting because really the relationship plot line is kind of the main plot line, but it's a negative relationship. So it kind of starts where we have these two magicians, Anger and Borden, and like they know each other, but they're not close. Okay. And Anger's wife dies in this water tank trick accident, and he blames Borden for tying the wrong knot, and he thinks that's why she died. And this starts off this whole feud between them where they're rivals and enemies. And as they're doing these magic shows, they're both trying to kind of destroy each other, and they get obsessed with taking each other down. And eventually gets to the point where they each are trying to kill each other at the end. And there's kind of a twist and stuff, which is interesting. I won't spoil it in case you haven't seen it, but it is an older movie. And so they go from being distant to just not liking each other and hating each other more and more to the end. Another example would be like me and Seb and La La Land, which I won't go into that much. That one's like a little bit happier than like people wanting to kill each other, but still kind of distant, have a relationship, and then being distant at the end. So those are the 4 basic types: positive change, negative change, positive steadfast, negative steadfast. That's my rundown on the basics.
Yeah, I was thinking of the La La Land one
Mm-hmm.
when you were talking about that. Kind of got me. Did not love
Yeah.
that one, but yes, I did. I was thinking of that. Yeah.
Because Jamie writes romance, so
Yes.
Oh,
and I
okay.
love rom-com, so we were both on the same page on La La Land. We were
Yeah.
like, what?
No, I felt the same way too. A lot of people love it, and I totally respect it, but I was kinda like, "Wait, that was kinda weird," and I was like, "Okay," like, yeah, I guess it's the idea of, like, sacrificing the relationship for her career, you know? But,
Yeah.
yeah, I was kinda like, "Oh, I don't see that very often in these types of movies, okay."
I
Yeah,
felt
Yeah.
like it was a bait and switch. Yeah.
me too.
It did kind
Yeah.
of have that vibe, whereas, like, some of and, yeah, maybe the listeners love La La Land, and that's okay if you do. But, yeah, I kinda had a similar vibe to that because, like, some of my other examples, you get a vibe that things might not go well or end well, like,
Mhm.
totally. Whereas that one, I kind of was like, I feel like all of a sudden it's like, "Oh, just kidding, they're not together," and I was like,
Mhm.
"Oh, I don't feel like I was prepared for that," but,
Yeah.
like, I can respect the creative decision, like, I get it's
Exactly.
intentional. But, yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
those bait and switch, I can relate to that experience.
Yeah.
It's like,
And
"Wait,
the,
what?"
and there's something about when you're expecting something and you don't get it, people talk
Mhm.
about it more. And
Yeah.
so
Well,
it
and that's
generates
true too,
more
yeah.
buzz, I guess, too. And
Mhm.
yeah. So, well, I did have a question. We're going to go on and talk about some relationship art variations, but I wanted to go back to, I feel like most genre writers are going to be probably in the positive, either change or positive
Mhm.
steadfast. And
Mhm.
since I write mystery series, I'm probably like most of the time my characters will get to a steadfast, like there will be they get together over several books, then they get together. And this, I think, has just given me ideas for how to
Mhm.
keep it going. And I think this is like the answer to the question of what do you do? Like the moonlighting conundrum, like they get together and then the story's over. This is a way you
Yeah.
can keep it going. So I just want to get your take on this. Like, I feel like you could have all kinds of ways to test them through different books, but it could be different types of things. Like maybe they have a financial crisis that they have to deal with, and then maybe they have like a physical health crisis or something. And like you could propel the story that way. Is that what you would recommend
Yeah,
for a series?
I think you could totally do something like that, yeah, you could find different crises, and sometimes it's just like a matter of priorities. Like maybe one character is prioritizing X thing, and the other character feels like it should be Y thing, and that
Mm,
could, if they feel really passionately or strongly about it, because I mean these are still individuals, obviously,
Mhm.
mhm,
then you can play with something like that. So basically, like how I feel about this is it's a lot of it is about finding the right antagonistic force, which is what you're touching on. And in relationships, because if it's a weak antagonistic force, it's annoying because it's like, okay, I already saw them overcome
mhm,
more in this relationship. Like, I
Right.
don't buy that. And so it's just looking for what could be a real challenge to for that relationship. And I feel like in relationships, this can come from like 3 basic areas. So one is it's going to be something external. And so and you can even look at the external plot line because sometimes what's happening externally is going to trickle down and affect the relationship and create issues in the relationship. So it could be something outside. It could be, a bad guy who's trying to keep them physically apart or getting one to turn on one another. Oh, it'll sound odd, but a good example of this is Shrek 2, because Shrek and Fiona totally together at the end.
mhm.
And then we see in the second one, they actually handled it very well, where Shrek's like trying to become something he's not, and like having to deal with these in laws, and they're trying to kind of fray them apart with Fiona. But like, so it could be something external. The antagonistic force can be something in the relationship. So even if the characters want to be together, we all
Mm,
know that doesn't necessarily mean to walk in the park, right? People
Right.
have different priorities. We have maybe the way I want to move forward in life has a very different vision than what this other person wants to move forward. how a lot of times they're connected by the same goal, not always, but if they are, then a lot of times what comes up is they're arguing about which is the best way to move forward. And so there can be tension there. Like, okay, so like Frodo and Sam. One of the main tensions between them becomes, are we going to follow Smeagol or not? And Sam doesn't sympathize with Smeagol at all, and he just wants him gone, whereas Frodo wants to follow him. So that starts to create tension there. So I guess also looking at other characters. And then a third place to go look is it can come from inside one of the characters. If you're having like an internal conflict or internal crisis in your life, that can bubble up and affect the relationships around you. So like I don't know. This is maybe a little extreme. I'm trying to think of examples off the top of my head, but if someone developed an addiction, like that's going to probably cause problems in the relationship.
Right.
So you kind of have to know your characters in the relationship to come up with like the right antagonistic force, but there are places to go looking, and you could even do more than one. You could have a combination, but just finding what could believably start to fray them or pull them apart. Now, depending on like what kind of story you're writing, this could sometimes just literally be like physical. So like I love the X-Files, love Mulder and Scully, but
Mhm.
often, the relationship isn't the main story. The main story is they're solving the X-Files and they're going against these government conspiracy people and smoking man. And often they are like close personally, but there's forces that are pulling them physically apart. Somebody's getting abducted and we have to rescue them or something. So
Mhm.
like if it's not like the main plot line, it could be something physical like that, or an illness even that's kind of
Mhm.
creating distance. But it could, if it's like more predominant, then usually it needs to come more from the relationship or within one of the characters. But anyway, so yeah, looking at positive, steadfast, like ways you can actually free that. I would say too, I don't think this is as popular, but it is an option. If you're writing a series that's like more than two books, so more than a duology, you could do something like a positive change for one installment, positive steadfast for second installment, negative change, maybe they're grown apart by the end of the third one, and then you could do some type of positive change again for the last one where they come back together. So you could do something like that. That's assuming you're like highlighting the same relationship for each book, because you could also do it where like, and it depends on what kind of series you're writing, where it's a different relationship getting highlighted in a different volume. But I'm
Mhm.
probably getting a little complex there, but hopefully that's helpful.
No, I think that's great. I think that will give people lots of ideas of things to work
Yes.
with, and kind of maybe they can go spark from off of that.
Right,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the relationship arc variations. Tell us about that and how it works and what it looks like.
Okay, yeah, cool. So if we think we have those four basic types, so theoretically, any relationship should be able to roughly fit into one of those basic types, because those are your only options. You're either going to change by the end or you're not. It's either going to be positive or negative. Now we
Correct.
can build off of that and get more detailed, and we can look at some variations, because of course in writing not everything is going to be like clear cut and black and white, but like having basic categories helps us to be able to discern things and see what we're working with and like manipulate things the way that we want to. So we have those basics. So there are some variations and some kind of gray areas that can happen too that I'd like to acknowledge as well. So the first one is just what I call love at a distance. So you can have a situation where the characters grow in love for each other, but they're also growing distant from each other. So you can see that's kind of a gray area. So this is kind of like an unusual situation, but it's not necessarily impossible. So like for example, you could have one character may observe the other and like come to love that person more deeply, while also simultaneously kind of drawing away from that other. So like a common trope that comes up with this is that like one character pulls away because he feels incapable or unworthy of the other person, and so resolves that they're just going to kind of love that person from afar in thought or even in action. um I hope your listeners don't hate me for using this example, but it's still very successful. In Twilight, Edward is often this way. He loves Bella, but he wants
Yes.
to create distance with her. Yes, so that's kind of how it shows up. Another way this can show up that I've seen is that one character loves the other character so much, but doesn't like what that character's doing to themselves or what's going on there, and so feels like they need to create distance because like they just can't handle watching this train wreck, if you can say it that way. Okay, so that's one. Another one I just call love your enemy. So sometimes the characters, they love each other or they learn to love each other, but they're still ultimately enemies. So that's also kind of a gray area. So you could have like the protagonist a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but not uncommonly, the protagonist will kind of see qualities in the antagonist that she has herself. So that can kind of lead to more hatred, kind of self-hatred in a sense, but it can also make the character feel a little bit closer to the antagonist, assuming the antagonist is a character. It isn't always. So in that sense, like the protagonist or whoever this character is begins to understand the other person like more intimately, but they still consider that person an enemy. So like in Ender's game, Ender is able to defeat his enemies because he understands them on a personal level. He even empathizes with them, but they're still his enemy. He still uses that against them. Another variation I call keep your enemies closer. So there's that common saying, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. So this is kind of similar to the last one, but it's a little different. So one character may be drawing closer, to the enemy and getting more personal with them, but they may not actually love them. They might actually even kind of hate them. And so, like, for example, you could have a serial killer and a detective or something, but the detective doesn't know who the serial killer is, but maybe the serial killer knows, what's going on. And he's trying to draw closer to the detective, but he actually, is getting close because maybe he wants to kill the detective, which kind of relates to the other one. But like just keeping your enemies really close, you can kind of see what's going on, but you don't actually care about that person. So that's kind of a gray area. The frenemy, so I'm probably familiar with that term. So it comes from the words friend and enemy. So it's kind of a relationship that's a mashup of those two. It could be that the friend is also an antagonist in the external plot line, or like a rival or something. I wouldn't really say this is an arc, but it's just kind of an option if that's interesting to keep in mind and bring in. You can have characters who are toxically close. So, typically, the most toxic relationships come from those we're closest to. So it's possible for people to like love their abusers or be codependent or something. And that has a lot of dysfunction that can be fun to look at in fiction. And maybe there's not enough boundaries in place in this relationship. So, like, that's kind of a gray area because it's like these characters are really close, but it's having a negative effect on them. It's not healthy. You can also have I just call this variation the collective, where it's like the character is really in a relationship with a group of people that acts more or less like a unit in the story. There might like it might not be that they all like act exactly the same. There might be some characters that kind of stand out of that group, but it's more like the relationship plot line is about that character and a group of people. So like you might have the protagonist and his football team, and that's kind of like the relationship plot line, or the protagonist and his staff. And so an example of that would be in Mean Girls, we have Katie who has a negative relationship with plastics, who are kind of like a collective. And sure, they're all different, but the relationship plot line is about her and this other group, this collective. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have for variations there. I'm sure there's like a lot more than what I've come up with because like the basics are meant for us to like start to see things more clearly and to build off of. It doesn't mean that everything is going to fit them perfectly. So I'm sure there's other ones out there, but those are some to keep in mind that can be fun to play around with as well.
Okay. And then all of those, though, can either be negative or positive, correct?
Yeah, I think depending on how you decide you want to arc it. I mean, some of these I feel like are probably leaned to more towards positive or negative, but like some of them are kind of like a gray area because it's like, well, they're distant, but they're close, but they're close, but they're distant. But I mean, I would
Right.
look more, yeah, I would look more at like how, because I feel like it gets a little complicated because we also have the other plot lines which could be influencing this. So like, I think it's helpful to be like, okay, what does this character want to be close to this person or want to be distant from this person? And so looking at it that way is to kind of categorize if it's positive or negative. If it starts to get a little blurry or fuzzy to you, that's what I like to look at. I'm like, okay, does this person want to be near this other person? If yes, then they want to do something positive. If no, then they want to create distance, then they want to do something negative. They want to turn it that way. I should mention too, you can also have characters who actually just want to maintain the relationship as is, which doesn't get talked about a whole lot. But so like Katniss and Gale, there's times where Katniss, she doesn't want to get closer to Gale, but she doesn't want to get more distant from Gale. She just wants to maintain it as is. And when that happens, usually there's still going to be some kind of antagonist that disrupts that. So it could even be the other character being like, no, I want to get closer, which is kind of what Gale does. And Katniss is like, no, like I can't deal with that right now. It could be something else that starts to pull away. And it's like, well, no, because I don't want us to be that distant. So you could also look at like situations where the character wants to maintain the relationship as it already is, but there's going to be other forces that are threatening to change that. And so then the character has to try to kind of fix it to get that equilibrium again. We don't see that like a ton, but that is something that can happen. So it's probably worth mentioning.
Interesting thought, though. I mean, that's an interesting thing to play around with because it could create a lot of conflict too. So, yeah. I love that.
Well, you have one more thing that you talked about in this post, and it was about putting labels on to kind of map what's going on in your story. So can you give us a couple of examples of how that might be helpful, like helping us keep track of where the relationship arc is going?
Yeah, totally. So once you kind of have your basics, like, oh, this is a positive change arc, or this is a negative steadfast arc, or whatever, sometimes it's helpful to get a little more specific from there, just so you kind of have like markers about how this relationship is evolving through the story. So you could just keep it simple, like beginning to end. They started as strangers and they end up best friends, or like a lot of us have probably heard the phrase enemy to lovers story, which basically just sums up what that arc is. So sometimes if you want to get a little more specific, like you could be like, okay, classmates to found family, or brothers to enemies. I mean, obviously biologically they're still brothers, but you get what I mean. The relationship turns to something that's more like enemies. So you could just do that from like beginning to end to just kind of map it. But you can also put in, if there's more stages in there, you can put more stages in there. You could go from like, okay, they start out as strangers, then in the middle they're going to become allies, and then by the end they're going to be best friends. Or in the beginning they start out as lovers, and in the middle they're going to become exes because they've been torn apart, but at the end they're going to be lovers again. So you can do that, beginning, middle, end, if you wanted to add more, because a lot of people like to look at stories in quarters. So you could also do 4 in there if you wanted to. Just kind of depends on what your story is. But if you can kind of like just map out with more specific labels, I feel like that's a little helpful to define where exactly you're going, like what direction and when. So like even if you looked at I love BBC Sherlock, but you could even map that out. They started as strangers, then they're roommates, and then they're best friends. Or one that I find a relationship that I find kind of interesting is Nancy and Steve in Stranger Things, and the last season hasn't come out yet, so I don't know how it's totally going to be resolved if you're looking at it from like a whole perspective. But up to this point, they kind of start out as love interests, and then they become a couple, and then they're exes, and then they're friends. But Steve kind of has feelings for her still. So we're just kind of mapping these different stages it can go through. And even if you're just brainstorming, I tend to think of this when I already have like an idea. But even if you're like brainstorming, you could put in different states in here, different labels, and then that might get your mind thinking about how you want this relationship to change and evolve. So that's kind of basically how that idea goes. If you find that helpful, I don't know that it's going to be helpful for everyone. Like definitely take what resonates with you. Don't feel like you have to do everything I say. But yeah, if you find that helpful to get a little more specific, because I just feel like relationship arcs and plot lines, unless you are writing like romance, tend to be very vague and, like we mentioned, not talked about a lot in the community. So if you can get a little more definition and a little more specificity, it can give you an idea of like, okay, this is the direction I'm going. This is what needs to happen in this relationship by this point or whatever. Just like a lot of people find it helpful with character arcs, my character's going to start like this, and this is how they're going to end up. Similar idea, but just looking at it with relationships.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to have like, because I don't do like a super detailed outline or plot, but I do know the main things that I want to hit. And if I think of a relationship arc that way and okay, this is where they don't like each other, this is where they're kind of figuring out that they're not so terrible, then maybe they kind of start to like each other. Having that big overarching label for that section can help me keep in mind what I need to be doing and keep it and make it make sense so that people don't feel like, oh, but we've already done this like 4 times and it's no fun that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point because that brings to mind like sometimes when I'm editing, I can tell the writer doesn't know where to take the relationship, but that they want that relationship there. And so it starts to feel like we're just kind of circling the same thing, And it's like, okay, but ideally, really with any kind of plot line, rather than just like kind of circling the same state, we want like I like to think of it as zigzags, instead of circling, we're zigzagging or something. And of course, you can have like a zigzag or a zag, as I like to say. But like in relationships, usually it's gonna be like on a basic level, there's forces pushing together and pulling them apart. So like some people feel like, okay, and I'm not saying you have to do this, but some people find it helpful. Like, okay, at the end of the beginning, act 1, they're going to be close. Then at halfway, midpoint, they're going to be pulled apart. And then after that, end of act 2, they're going to be pushed together. So like you can like map it back and forth like that. But you could also do something like Revenge of the Sith, where it's like we start close and we progressively get further and further and further apart. But like looking at stuff like that keeps you from just like kind of circling the same state where it's like it's a relationship, but it doesn't feel like a relationship plot line because it's not progressing or like degressing, like going backwards one way or the other. So it's better to kind of create that zigzag or back and forth as opposed to just like we're kind of hovering, like we're a couple, we're a couple, we're a couple. And it's like, okay, but like I need something more. There was a very popular series, I won't say the title, but very popular series, trilogy. By the time I got to the 3rd book, I kind of wanted the protagonist and the love interest to just break up because like I felt like their relationship, there was like a lot of fighting in it, but like it wasn't going anywhere. Like it just felt like we kept circling the same arguments. That's just what my experience was. And I was like, okay, could they at least like break up or something change? Or can they just get over this like conflict and start something new? So it doesn't feel like we're just kind of hovering the same state for forever. So yeah, definitely think mapping out could help with that.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been amazing. I love it. I've taken notes because I'm kind of in the beginning stages of something, and it's just so interesting because you don't think about a relationship arc. And I do write romance, so that's just part of the thing. But I think even for romance authors, this is really helpful. I love it.
Well, yeah, I think too, even if you're writing romance, a lot of times there's still another important relationship going on besides the main couple, so you could do this, you could look at this for another relationship arc that's going on in the story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we always like to ask our guests, what's the best thing you've done to set yourself up for success?
Ooh. Okay, well, I have one that's more concrete and practical, and I have things that are more like internal type stuff. So, I mean, I want to say to me, being persevering and learning from your failures, huge part of being successful. Keep trying, but like, don't just keep trying by doing the same thing if it didn't work, right? So, learning from your failures, and like keep trying, and I guess that links back to the idea of like progressing on a personal level. As long as you're learning and growing, you're being successful. In a more practical, real world sense, that's a little more tangible. One thing, it might sound strange, but one thing that has been super helpful for me is to wake up early. I'm an early bird. I have not always been an early bird. I became an early bird because I wanted to wake up early and get some writing done before I would go to my job. And it had a huge impact on me personally and like how successful of a day I could have and just like what I could get done that day. So old me would have never believed it would have been that impactful. But in a practical sense, like that has been one thing that I've done that I feel like has made me more successful, like even just on a day by day level, but also in long term because like there's some days I can get 4 hours of stuff done before anyone else is even up doing anything. If you have 4 extra hours, think of
Yeah.
what you could do. Now, of course, if you can't get to bed early, then waking up early is probably not, if you have a baby or something, like
Yeah.
I'm not saying everyone has to do this, but if it is an option, like I've noticed a really big difference in my life by waking up early. So there's my practical one, and there's my more just like internal abstract. Don't give up, okay? Those are your
Excellent.
options to consider.
I love
Yeah.
those. I
Yeah,
love
that
those. So
is-
what time do you get up? If you don't mind me
I
asking.
wake up at 5 or 5:30 usually. Yeah.
That's early. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I love the practical and the more less concrete, I guess. But I think
Yeah,
that's
I was
great.
like, I don't know, abstract, I guess is the way I would describe it. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, where can people find out more about you? And you have a course, right?
Oh yeah. So you can go to my website /blog, septembercfawkes.com. If you cannot remember my name, you can also get to it with writebetterwithaneditor.com. I do freelance developmental and line editing, so I do have that going on. But I do have an online course now. It's newer. Last year was the first year that I did it. And it's called the Triarchy Method. You can also find that on my site. You can Google it. And it's an online course, but it is live. So we meet twice a week, classes 75 minutes long. It's a 12-week course, so it's longer. And we go really deep into character, plot, and theme and how to structure those things so that you have a really solid I call them the bones. It's the bones of story. It's a developmental course, content course. So you have really solid bones for your story. We actually do have a whole section on relationship arcs and plot lines as well that we get into that kind of ties into what we've talked about as well. So we don't have a date for when I'm going to teach it again. I just got done teaching it like a month ago, but I will teach it again, and you can go to my website. You can sign up for my emailing list to like know when it's going to be open again. But yeah, it's called the Triarchy Method, and it's been going great so far. We've had a lot of good feedback, and I've enjoyed teaching it.
That's great. That's
That is
great.
great. Well, thank you for coming on and just walking us through that. I think it'll be really, really helpful. We appreciate it. And we will have all the links in the show notes, and those will be at wishidknownforwriters.com. And if you want to support the podcast, you can go to that same link /support. And thanks to Adriel Wiggins for doing the admin and to Alexa Larberg for doing the producing of the podcast. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember our sponsor, Xero Accounting Software. Use discount code WishI'dKnownNen20 and get 20% off of Xero subscription services for 3 months. Thanks for listening. Keep writing, and we'll talk to you guys next week.